I'd like to call the Senate Finance and Appropriations Committee to order, and the clerk will call the roll, please.
You have a quorum, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Well, good morning. As we begin our first meeting of the 2023 session, I would like to impart some guidance and direction on the important work of our committee and especially of our subcommittees. First, there are approximately 3 weeks before we report the Senate budget. I will ask that members commit to working toward adopting a budget that all committee members can support and that focuses on good policy decisions. Next, by the end of this week, most, if not all, of our subcommittees will have met at least once this year. We're working toward identifying the critical areas in each, the critical issues in each area, and we need to continue that dialogue. Subcommittee members should have a comprehensive knowledge of the matters before your subcommittee. Please work with staff members on any needed research and guidance. Subcommittee chairs, please make sure that our staff know what you need to get the job done in your role as chair. For your reference, I have redistributed the staff assignment list with areas of responsibility for each. Turning back to committee organization generally, bills will not be assigned to subcommittees except in the case where public hearings beyond the capacity of the full committee are appropriate, and in instances where the subcommittee must continue the totality of such bills, such as those with a Woodrum impact. I will try to limit the number of bills assigned so that your subcommittee can devote maximum time to evaluating your specific areas of budget development. Additional guidance is included in the organization materials in your notebooks. Please review these materials and make note of the committee procedures for acting on referred bills and guidance on the consideration of tax incentive bills. I will mention that with our time constraints, if a member asks their scheduled bill go by more than once, there is no assurance that the committee will have the opportunity to hear it again. Let me repeat that to make sure it sinks in. Because of our time constraints, if a member asks that their scheduled bill go by more than once, there is no assurance that the committee will have the opportunity to hear it again. The committee meeting schedules will remain the same as in prior years. Attendance at all assigned meetings is expected as your role is important to each. Senator Barker and I will continue to be briefed by staff weekly, and we will spend a great deal of time evaluating bills and recommend certain actions for your consideration. We may also decide to convene a resource or other special subcommittee as we evaluate the number of bills that are before the full committee. I also want to note that we will continue the practice of not hearing additional public comment when public comment has already been taken in the committee of origin. That's another one, let me repeat. We will continue the practice of not hearing additional public comment when public comment has already been taken in the committee of origin. And I want to thank the committee in advance for your hard work and dedication to this committee. I know it's a major consumer of your time while down here. Before moving to our next agenda item, I want to announce that Jason Powell is leaving our staff to become a special advisor to the Secretary of Transportation. Jason has been with the committee since October of 2007 and has been a very valuable of our team and especially valuable to me. Thank you, Jason. Contributing to many.
Congratulations.
Well, I was going to ask everybody. No, I was going to say everybody to clap in appreciation, but you already did. So, okay.
It was not because you're leaving.
And I'd like to turn this over to April and ask that she officially introduce our two new staff members.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I also want to thank Jason for his time with the committee. He was a part of multiple major initiatives over the year, a number of those in transportation and natural resources, and some major rewrites. So I also want to thank Jason as well. I have sent an email out to the committee members for the new staff members, but I wanted to just reiterate just quickly and briefly who they are. First, Wendy Kong is here. She has 22 years of state experience. She will be covering the areas of higher education and K-12. She started her career with JLARC. She worked at the Virginia Community College System around workforce, which I think will be particularly useful during this session. And then most recently, she was at Chev over the areas of finance and a number of things that are very important for the committee. Our next person is Kendra Brown-Shiflett. She comes to us from the Virginia Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. She started her career at the Department of Mines, Mineral and Energy, which is Mines, Mineral and Energy, which is now the Department of Energy. And then she spent more than a decade at the Department of Planning and Budget, where she had agricultural and natural resource agencies, as well as economic development. She's covering those areas, as well as transportation, and she has 28 years of state experience. So I want to thank them both for joining us. They will be going through the presentation today. Madam Chair mentioned that the staff assignments are in the notebook under one of those tabs for you, but I do also want to note Jessica Dotson is now covering general government, and Mike Tweedy currently has compensation and retirement. So those are some of the major changes. And those of you know, during the annual meeting, Tyler Williams is covering revenues, forecasting, tax policy, and capital outlay. So those are the
Okay,
main
and
changes.
before we move on, I would just like to say that in general, on Tuesdays, I will chair this committee, and on Wednesdays, co-chair Barker will be chairing.
All right, thank you, Madam Chair. Can somebody put the PowerPoint? Got it, thank you. PowerPoint up. All right. Turning to the staff PowerPoint, we're going to try to cover this very quickly, as a number of the analysts have covered some of this in subcommittee, or will continue to do that. If you turn to page 4, I'm just going to give you the highlights of some of the things that came over. As you know, the proposed amendments are to the biennial budget, which you passed, which was Chapter 2 in the 2022 Special Session 1. And let me go to this slide. There we go. Those revenue adjustments reflect net additional $1.2 million over the biennium, including almost $2.2 general fund and economic growth, and a reduction, though, and Tyler will cover this in more detail, of about $1 billion in proposed tax policy actions. And then when you combine that with the surplus, I'm just looking at the third bullet there, economic growth, proposed tax policy actions, and assumed resources available for appropriations is about $3.5 billion. The proposed changes in general fund spending total about $3.5 billion over the biennium. Million. And one thing I do want to note that's important, because we had a lot of one-time resources again, is that there's about $605 million in general fund cash and capital outlay. There's some contingent spending items that I'm going to cover in a later slide, where the governor proposes to do some items that can be unallotted to sort of prepare for a possible recession. And then the unappropriated balance is $15.4 million at the end of the biennium. And just to note, you left an unappropriated balance when you passed the budget in June of about $16 million. And I'm going to let Tyler cover the next couple of slides.
Okay. Turning to slide 5 on the revenues, you'll remember when the governor was developing his resources forecast for the upcoming session that the FY23 resources had not been adjusted for the mid-session reforecast last February, or for the additional revenue that was unanticipated at the end of fiscal year 22. And so that was updated this fall. And so you assume in total $1.1 billion in additional general fund revenues. $2.1 million is related to revenue growth. It is anticipated for slower growth in fiscal year 24 due to an anticipated recession. Revenue growth, excluding any proposed policy changes in Senate Bill 800, is assumed to decrease 8.6% in fiscal year 23 and increase 5.2% in fiscal year 24. But as April mentioned, the governor proposed $1 billion in tax policy adjustments that have not been adopted by the General Assembly, which includes tax conformity. And so when you adjust for the assumed tax policy in Senate Bill 800, you assume an 8.8% revenue reduction in the first year and 1.9% in the second year. Slide 6 details those assumed tax policy actions. As I mentioned, there's tax conformity, there's the reduction for the highest marginal individual income tax rate, reducing that from 5.75 to 5.5. There's an additional increase to the standard deduction. There's elimination on the age limit for the military retiree tax subtraction. There's a reduction in the corporate income tax rate proposed, and then there's 2 business expense deductions for businesses, and then there's also a sales and use tax exemption. So in total, that's $1 billion, and then you can see in that table the impact going out through fiscal year 28. And then in the introduced budget, there was a proposal to remove the language commonly referred to as the growth triggers or revenue thresholds required for the standard deduction to increase that the General Assembly had adopted. And you'll hear more tomorrow from the Secretary of Finance on the revenue collections year to date and if that threshold has been met. Slide number 7 really details to how you get to that $3.4 billion that April mentioned. So you'll see on that right-hand column the changes, and so that you see in the first 3 lines the net adjustments to the balances. That's really reflecting unanticipated fiscal year 22 revenue and then any unspent appropriations in fiscal year 22 and then the adjustments to those balances. And then the second part of the table, you see the adjustments for the revenue forecast and the tax policy adjustments, which get you to total resources of $1.1 billion. And then when you add that with your unanticipated revenues from fiscal year 22 that carry forward, you get to the bottom of the line that gives you $3.4 billion in additional resources that are available for appropriation.
Again, just a reminder that the unappropriated balance is $15.4 million, and then I'm going to remind you about the items that you had contingent because you're going to see some big spending items. And you might remember back in Chapter 2, there was $585.5 million in contingent items because you anticipated that you would have larger than expected revenue. And you'll see those. It included the deposit to VRS, the I-64 improvements, the Virginia Business Ready Sites program, some capital outlay supplements, and then a deposit to the Major Headquarters Workforce Grant Fund, knowing there's going to be a large payment upcoming. And the reason I'm going to highlight over the next 2 slides, there are a number of very large amounts on some of these items. So these are things you're going to want to consider as you're thinking about the budget. The first of which is capital outlay cash. It's a good one-time use of resources. I'm going to tell you if it's got a little sort of, I don't even know what to call that, the little up and down thing there. That I don't know what that character is called. What is it? Carrot. It denotes that there was an appropriation of those Chapter 2 contingent amounts, thank you, Jason, that I just mentioned. If it's got an asterisk, then that is it's going to be contingent in the proposed spending, which I'm going to cover in a minute. But again, this is capital outlay cash is a good time use of resources. So you've got contingent pots that were in both Chapter 2 and what's proposed in the introduced. Part of the concern there, I think from the administration and from you all as well, has been that a number of the current projects are having very large cost overruns related to inflation. So that's why you see such a large number there. As the next item, Business Ready Sites and Development Program, it's very large. It's $450 million. If you look further down, there's the $50 million that you had contingent that got appropriated. I'm not going to go through all of these. I'll mention the mandatory rainy day deposit. You'll see that VRS amount. There's $200 million in DCR for a revolving loan fund. And then there's a number of state employee actions, bonuses, et cetera. I'm again not going to cover all those because the analysts are going to cover it in great detail. And then on this next page, I go all the way down to the pots of $30 million. But just so you know, if you look in the summary of the document that we did that's posted on our website that Melissa May sent to all of you, there are a number of things that go $24.5 million, $20 million. There's a lot of items where there's significant spending in the introduced budget. So again, not going to belabor that, but I put this here so you could take a look at it. As far as in the introduced budget, there are contingent policies. It's about, rounds up to about 1.1 billion there. And if you look, they can be, these tax policies, there's actions that can be unallotted, whether it's a spending or a tax policy action, and then it can be reverted to the general fund to offset the impact of any revenue shortfall. And the items that are here are reducing that income tax rate from 5.75 to 5.5. That additional funding of part of the additional funding for site development, that $250 million, $100 million for that part of that Resilient Virginia revolving loan fund, one of the employee bonuses, and that part of that capital cost overrun funding. It's contingent on fiscal 2023, the fiscal year you're currently in, meeting the forecast that has been assumed in the budget, and that those revenues are less. Then that reduction in the top marginal income tax rate doesn't go into effect in tax year 2024. And then those other $750 million in spending items will be unallotted by the director of DPB. The language also, though, permits the governor to restore with available resources the reduction to the individual income tax rate and the spending allotments in the priority listed in the budget. So just so you're aware of that. And then I'll complete my portion of the presentation by just reminding you that the reserve balances are projected to total $4.2 billion by the end of the second year of the biennium. The introduced budget includes almost $905 million for mandatory deposits to the rainy day fund. You might remember about $500 million of that had been set aside in the actions you took in Chapter 1. Back in 2020, earlier in this year, and the other 406 you saw as a spending item on the list on those 2 pages earlier. So if there are no questions for me, I will turn it over to Wendy.
Good morning. For the K-12 education, before we go over the governor's introduced budgets, we just want to provide this quick slide for you to remind you of what was already passed and is already in the budget, because there is a significant investment in K-12. You'll see going into this session in the budget is $2.9 billion. And just to note a few of the items that have already been passed: the 5% salary increase, funding for school construction grants, the increased support positions, and funding for the students placed at risk, the bonuses, the College Partnership Lab School Fund, and the establishment of the reading specialists in K through 3. So for public education, in direct aid, there's $441 million in general fund in the governor's introduced budget. More than half of that is for technical updates and forecast changes. As a quick note, there is an increase in the student enrollments over last year of about 0.7%, or 8,200 students, but this is still below the peak of 2019-2020, where we are still expecting to see the declines of the population, and that was mentioned at the annual meeting. In terms of the policy amendments that are provided, you'll see a few here, and I'll highlight. For the College Partnership Lab School Fund, there's an additional $50 million that would bring the total in the first year up to $150 million. There's $5,000 in teacher performance bonuses, and these are for top performing teachers. And this is related, the performance be measured on SOLs or growth assessments. There's also the state share of the 1% retention bonus, and an expansion of the reading specialists. As I mentioned, they're in the prior budget, or the current budget, has the establishment of the kindergarten through 3rd grade. This would expand it to 4th and 5th grades. There's a $5,000 targeted recruitment bonuses, and then math specialist positions in K through 8 schools with the lowest 10% of math scores. So this was targeted to help address some of the learning loss. There's some other items outside of the direct aid to public education. The Secretary of Education is asking for 3 positions, also some adjustments for the Department of Ed and the School for the Blind. And there's some language changes to allow some temporary flexibility for childcare ratios and also for the community-based BPI initiative. I'll pause for any questions, and if not, move over to higher ed.
Madam Chair,
Senator Abbott.
do we know what the new positions are for the Secretary of Education?
Madam Chair, yes, there's 3 positions proposed. One is for early childhood, the second one is related to post-secondary education, and the third one is for workforce.
Thank you.
For higher education, again, we provide this as just a slide of what is already in the budget, and there was $852 million that was provided in Chapter 2. And just to highlight a few areas, there's money for the affordable access, $286 million, significant investments in undergraduate financial aid, funding for our 2 HBCUs, investments in a Pell Initiative, an increase to the tuition assistance grant, and some increases in research. In addition, this does not include the amounts that are provided in central accounts for the 5% salary increases. So for the higher education proposed policy amendments with the governor, the largest investment, and it's about $45 million, the largest is going to the community colleges. The first area is the pilot industry credentials in high schools. This is for 5 pilots and to provide industry credentials in high schools. Some funding to increase career placement, staffing, and some centers. Promotion of the G3 and Fast Forward programs. That's the free, generalized as the free college for high demand programs in both industry credentials and degree programs. $10 million for an EBMS and ODU merger. Funding for a mental health initiative that'll run through the State Council of Higher Education, and some additional funding to VCU and UVA-WISE. And in terms of other areas, there's an investment of $5 million in the internship program, and that's in central accounts, and also noted that the bonuses apply to the faculty and staff that will be covered for all state employees. There's some language adjustments here too for alternative financing, and I'll be happy to answer any questions related to higher education if you have them.
Are there questions? Apparently not.
Okay, I'll now turn it over to Mike to go through HHR.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So starting off with HHR, just a quick overview. So in recent years, as you all well know, that HHR has actually kind of been giving back in the sense that in Medicaid, the enhanced federal match that's resulted from the public health emergency that Congress has extended to the states usually results in a type of net savings. So what you see in the amended budget is basically for a couple additional quarters of enhanced federal match for Medicaid, it kind of basically results in a net decrease for Medicaid over the biennium of $113.5 million. Just to note that that sort of enhanced federal match is coming to an end. Congress did pass their omnibus spending bill back in December. They basically separated the public health emergency from the Medicaid enhanced match. So effective April 1st of this year, that's basically when it ends. What Congress did do, though, was to help the states, was to phase down the enhanced match to the end of calendar year 23. So what's not in these amendments is 2 additional quarters of enhanced federal match. That's something that the committee will be looking at in its budget amendments. So looking at the actual there are other general spending items. The largest one is about $153 million within HHR for additional behavioral health funding. This is all tied, of course, to the administration's announcement and focus on behavioral health. Then there's $80 million if you look at the Medicaid forecast, as well as the healthcare fund, which uses state match for Medicaid. The revenues that go up and down typically from year to year for the healthcare fund have to be offset with general funds to make sure Medicaid is fully funded. There's $48.5 million for healthcare workforce programs, which I'll go into more detail in the health department when I touch on that one. One large rate increase was a 5% rate increase for Medicaid personal care on July 1, and as you know, that falls, this past year was 7.5% is what the General Assembly had authorized. And then you see some other smaller ones that includes an additional 500 TD waiver slots in this for fiscal year -- So you can see at the bottom, it just notes that the general fund savings amendments, about $538 million, and that's primarily the enhanced federal match for Medicaid. So just kind of summarizing the behavioral health amendments, you can see within actual HHR and the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Services, there's about 131 million total. The largest part of that is what you'll see, Comprehensive Crisis Services System. That's really focused on the crisis receiving centers, crisis stabilization units, and sort of the assessments. There's a lot of terms in there, but essentially the intent and the goal is that when you go to a crisis, the official name would be a crisis receiving and stabilization center. You can get everything from assessment to to stabilization within 23 hours, and if you need a few days longer, up to 7 days after that. So the idea to continue to find it to be an alternative to basically inpatient hospitalization and being TDO'd. You'll see that there's additional $20 million for hospital-based psychiatric emergency alternatives. This is basically a psychiatric ER. You ought to introduce a few years ago an amendment that provided $2.5 million to do this at Carilion. And so essentially what it basically means is when you have someone waiting in the ER, they actually bring, whether it's psychiatrists or other mental health professionals, to actually provide treatment in the ER while they're waiting either to be TDO'd or for a bed. And sometimes the goal is if you can stabilize the person in that period of time, then you don't even have to go to the next step of a TDO. So the governor has $20 million in to basically expand this for anywhere from 3 to 6 additional health systems. Mobile crisis units, this basically increases the number. This is also a key component of the crisis system, that after you call, basically dial 988, that essentially if you need something more than someone on the phone to help you, that in theory, a mobile crisis unit could respond to prevent more intensive treatments later on. So there's currently 34 in the state. This would actually expand it up to around 70. School-based mental health pilots, $15 million. This is an initiative last year that this committee had endorsed to put $2.5 million to kind of start this. The governor added $15 million. Again, this is to basically partner with schools to provide a more intensive level of mental health services within the schools that goes beyond just what a typical school counselor could do. There's also some additional salary adjustments for lower wage positions within the state hospitals for housekeeping and food service staff. That kind of follows up on last year's focus on direct care staff. There's $8 million to do housing for individuals with serious mental illness. So this actually provides additional options of housing for group homes. There's also $1 million for the off-duty officer program to assist with temporary detention orders. This is something that the department started with their own internal funds. It's really focused on basically just paying for off-duty officers to either transport or wait with an individual while they're waiting for a bed in the ER. So I just noted the other places that within VDH, in Medicaid, there's $9.1 million for other types of loan repayment programs to specifically support behavioral health, as well as psychiatric residency slots paid for by Medicaid. Wendy already mentioned in SHEV, there's $9 million for mental health services for K-12 and higher ed. And then you'll see that in the compensation board, there's also a pilot program for transportation with the sheriffs. And just to note too, there's other non-general funds, which largely comes from the opioid settlements. There's a part that kind of flows to the state that not directly to the authority. Within that, there's like almost $15 million for fentanyl response efforts, naloxone, public awareness campaigns to deal with fentanyl. The next slide just kind of gives you a few other smaller amendments within DBHGS. Like I'll just note 3 additional forensic evaluators. These are the folks within the state hospitals that help to evaluate and kind of treat the forensic population that are waiting to be restored to competency to stand trial. So that kind of increases their capacity to kind of process those individuals. And you can note the other ones are mainly administrative in nature. Moving to the Department of Health, the other major initiatives, there's $48.5 million for basically workforce related to healthcare. You can note that the big one, $30 million, is the Earn to Learn Nursing Education Acceleration Program. So this is kind of working with hospitals to kind of connect them with students, to kind of bring them into kind of the pipeline to become whether it's nurses or other healthcare workers. But it can also be in the case if LPNs want to kind of move up to become RNs and that sort of stuff, basically trying to raise your level of skill and to become higher level professionals. The Nurse Preceptor Incentive Program, this was also one that the General Assembly had funded last year as well to kind of start that. So this helps pay for the preceptors who actually kind of supervise the students in the hospital environment. There's also the $5 million to create the Psychiatric Nursing Graduate Education Loan Repayment Program. So again, this is kind of focused, and it's not just psychiatric nurses, it's also nurse practitioners, kind of encourage that pipeline as well. The Behavioral Health Loan Repayment Program was also something created in recent years by the General Assembly, and this adds $2.5 million. It was actually the initial appropriation, basically was, they met it very quickly, and it's oversubscribed. And then additional $1 million for nursing scholarships and loan repayment programs. The other two things just to note here, at the bottom, you see other things in the health department. The state match for drinking water infrastructure grants in the second year is $3.4 million. That's to match from the bipartisan infrastructure law that had passed by Congress. This will bring down over 90 million additional federal dollars for drinking water. And then just to note, a salary adjustment for the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner. Basically, they're actually doctors, and the wages that they're struggling to keep them. Out of the 20 that we have in the state right now, I think we only have 11. So just because surrounding states are paying much higher rates for those individuals, so there's $1.5 million to kind of promote that retention. Moving to DMAS, I won't go into great detail. The first few at the top is the Medicaid forecast. You've seen that before. That just matches what came out last November. The healthcare fund, like I said, the state match for Medicaid. This is where tobacco taxes, Medicaid recoveries, as well as the master settlement agreement for tobacco manufacturers goes. It kind of goes up and down based upon things. The MCO repayments where they've had higher profits than typically have been repaid to the healthcare fund. And so, of course, as those revenues go up or down, it has to be adjusted as well. You also see the next few kind of represent the extension of the public health emergency, which I already mentioned how that process is going to work, and the children's health insurance programs, which also are affected by the enhanced federal match. Just to note, the personal care rate increase of 5% is the $41.6 million, 500 additional DD waiver slots. That would be on top of the 600 that are already authorized in the Appropriation Act. So that would bring it to a total of 1,100 slots in fiscal year '24. Just most of the things at the bottom you can see are mainly administrative in nature. There was restoring the early intervention services and Medicaid rate increase of 12.5%. That was sort of an unintentional thing that wasn't picked up last year to continue that rate increase going forward. And then there's the 20 psychiatric residency slots paid for by Medicaid. So moving to the Department of Social Services, the biggest ones here is like the TANF Unemployed Parent Program. TANF is a non-general fund program, but there is a component to it where two-parent families where they're both unemployed. It's a state-only program. It's actually doubled in size in the last year. And largely that's just because of the, just the impact of the COVID and the economy. But it also has to kind of deal with how we, the required workforce participation in the program. So it actually affects, so what will happen is once the federal public health emergency ends, those participation requirements go back into effect, and that population is expected to decline. For Child Protective Services, there's $8.3 million. This adds basically positions in the local departments as well as regionally. So the Office of the State Inspector General report of a few years ago basically was very critical of the Child Protective Service system. Its recommendations actually would have required probably the neighborhood of 800 to 900 additional positions throughout the state. So this is a more modest increase to kind of move toward adding the additional people needed. And just to note, there is a SNAP repayment to the federal government. Basically, we overpaid. A rate increase was implemented a little bit too fast, and so the department has to repay that to the federal government. Just to note the next slide, the disability service agencies are a lot smaller, but blind and vision impaired and aging and rehabilitative services both having small increases for their vocational rehabilitation program. And then lastly, for other health and human resources amendments, the Children's Services Act, basically because we're about the program is about 300 students down on the private day special education, which is the more expensive population within CSA, partly due, I think, to COVID, as well as the fact that, I think some school systems are probably making greater efforts to kind of keep them in the schools. There's also congregate foster care placements are also down as well. So you can see that saves about $6.9 million out of the appropriation, and they reverted about $29 million in balances from the previous year. The Secretary of Health and Human Resources has several contractors to do various things, such as behavioral health implementation. The Department of Health Professions has additional positions to improve application processing. The Opioid Abatement Authority is actually, while it is independent, it is also established as an agency under the Health and Human Resources area. That's where the money will flow from the settlements. And then lastly, just to note in Part 4, this is something that comes up that y'all have seen before, is the restrictions in spending. So the current law basically says that appropriations out of the act are limited to those as pursuant to federal law or state statute. Federal law refers, of course, to the Hyde Amendment at the federal level, which you are all familiar with. State statute allows in the case of gross fetal abnormality. So that is the one exception. What this does is strike the state law part, which basically would prohibit any expenditures from the health department for gross and fetal abnormality. So with that, Madam Chair, that concludes HHR.
Are there questions? Okay, thank you.
Moving to public safety and veterans. So similar to other areas, there were significant increases last year for public safety and veterans, a total of over $400 million general fund over the biennium. That included investments for public safety officers. This number here shows Department of Corrections, Department of Juvenile Justice, and State Police. There was also some increases under compensation board for sheriffs and regional jail officers. Also investments last year in Chapter 2 for the 599 program, community-based violence, crime reduction grants, and there was significant funding under ARPA for law enforcement equipment and training. Proposed amendments this year in the governor's proposed budget, we'll hit these on the next slide, but the biggest items are $30 million for an Operation Bold Blue Line initiative, $20 million for Operation Ceasefire, and 10.9, which is varying compensation adjustments across those employee groups I mentioned earlier. Moving to the next slide, so Operation Bold Blue Line, this is $30 million that is administered by the Department of Criminal Justice Services. This can be used to either grants to localities for law enforcement recruitment and training or state-focused strategies. The $20 million, you'll remember last year we established the Operation Ceasefire Grant Fund in tandem with the Firearm Violence Intervention and Prevention Grant Fund. Currently in Chapter 2, there's $2.5 million for that Operation Ceasefire, and this would increase it by $20 million. The other large item in the Department of Criminal Justice Services is to establish a mass violence care fund. This is for victims of mass violence and would include, but not be limited to, out-of-pocket expenses that are not covered by insurance. The other two items I'll highlight on this slide are VITA transformation, Part 2 for the state police. That's $9.4 million. This is something that was started a few years ago, and this is the second phase of it. And also in terms of the helicopters, we'd heard at the annual retreat, there's 2 helicopters for med flight and other services that need to be replaced. It ended up being only about $200,000 each year because we're doing it through the Master Equipment Leasing Program. Moving to the next slide, the 2 things I'll highlight here are salary increases for vacant positions. So last year, as you'll remember, the General Assembly decided not to provide the salary increases for vacant positions at the Department of Corrections. So this would provide those salary increases for about 900 across corrections and probation and parole. There's also $5.3 million to continue the Lawrenceville Correctional Center contract. This is the state's only privately contracted facility, and this includes about $2.5 million that is the CPI adjustment included in the contract. And then the third thing I'll highlight here is for the Department of Juvenile Justice. This past year, the DJJ board voted in November to implement increased length of stay guidelines that are set to take effect in July. And so they're anticipating some increased capacity for that. So this has a couple proposals that get at that anticipated additional need for beds at the Department of Juvenile Justice. Moving to the last slide. So for Veterans Affairs, the most significant items are V3 grants, Virginia Values Veterans. Right now, these are funded at $1,000 per veteran hire, and this would move it up to $5,000, as well as some other changes. There's also $400,000 for burial fees to cover spouses and dependents of veterans and members of the National Guard and Army Reserve. Right now, those individuals are not eligible. They have to pay a fee to be buried in veteran cemeteries. And then the only non-general fund item I'll highlight is the new Veterans Care Centers. There's a non-general fund increase of $20.5 million and also an increase of $17 million in a working capital advance for the 2 new Veterans Care Centers that were previously authorized in Virginia Beach and Fauquier County. Right now, we have 2 in Richmond and Roanoke. I'll cover this in more deep detail at the subcommittee meeting tomorrow morning, but unless there are any questions, I can hand it over for Commerce and Trade.
Okay, are there questions? Yes, Senator Marsden.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Katie, the administration in their introduced budget was looking at negotiating with 3 juvenile detention centers around the state. Is that what they are proposing to deal with this increased daily population that they think will occur because of their increased lengths of stay?
That's correct. So the number on the slide includes both the JDC lease model, which they're basically planning to do about 30 beds. They don't know where, they're still reaching out, but basically the number on the slide is that JDC lease, and that's about 30 beds. And then there's, I believe, about 70 additional beds that's part of that would be at Bon Air. So that $3.5 million includes both the lease space and the Bon Air, and it's a prorated cost, so the annualized amount would be much higher.
Okay. Is that consistent with Madam Chair? Is that consistent with the analysis of future growth that was presented to us by the department?
It's not, and so I have the numbers to pull for our subcommittee meeting tomorrow morning, but if you look at the forecast that was presented in December, we are not over forecast. Like, we have additional capacity in what we have currently. I do think that part of the department's maybe nervousness is that they did not fully account for the length of stay guidelines and the impact there. So we'll talk about that a little bit tomorrow, but I think there is kind of a discrepancy from maybe what we heard in December and what they're nervous about because of these length of stay guidelines.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Katie.
Thank you.
Moving on to Commerce and Trade. Going to focus on the changes in the introduced bill and the Senate Bill 800. The introduced bill proposed net increases totaling $597 million in general fund over the biennium. Significant funding, $500 million general fund increase support for the Business Ready Sites program, including $50 million from designated FY 2022 balances. There's a significant change in the program in that they're proposing to do the new program will provide funding for land acquisition of up to 3 sites, and the Economic Development Partnership will work with the Department of General Services on that. There's also $35 million in general fund for the Major Headquarters Workforce Grant, and some funding for Go Virginia initiatives, and $11.4 million in non-general fund for the flood relief for the residents of Buchanan and Tazewell counties. Looking at the next chart, I'll just focus on a couple items here. We've already discussed the Business Readiness Sites program. There's also the funding for the Headquarters Workforce Grant. In DHCD, there's Go Virginia funding for workforce programs of $10 million. And there's also funding, Go Virginia funding for Virginia Agribusiness Initiative. And you'll see that funding goes across several different agencies. It adds up to about $5 million for controlled environment agriculture initiatives. And in the Department of Energy, there's the Virginia Power Innovation Fund, funded at $10 million. Moving now to the Secretary of Labor. The introduced budget provides $100 million in general fund for a supplemental deposit to the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund. And the General Assembly has appropriated about $1.2 billion in federal funds and about $18.7 million in general fund for the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund since December of 2020. And the trust fund is currently at about 55% solvency with a balance of about $1.46 billion. Also included in Part 3 of the budget bill is a line of credit for the Virginia Employment Commission and to help with operating costs during times of economic downturn. Moving to agriculture and forestry. The introduced budget included a $3.5 million deposit to the Agriculture and Forestry Industries Development Program, including focusing $1 million of that funding on this multi-agency initiative focused on agricultural technology. There's an additional $2.2 million for 15 positions to support a proposed hemp product registration and inspection program. In natural resources, the introduced budget proposed net increases totaling $608 million general fund over the biennium. Major spending included $237 million for a deposit to the Enhanced Nutrient Removal Certainty Program for wastewater treatment plants improvements, and those are focused on primarily the Hampton Roads Sanitation District. There's also funding of $137 million general fund for a deposit to the Natural Resources Commitment Fund for agricultural best management practices, and that includes $87 million in water quality improvement funds and $50 million in discretionary deposit. There's a $200 million general fund deposit to the Resilient Virginia Revolving Loan Fund and $100 million general fund to support the Richmond Combined Sewer Overflow.
Madam Chair? On the money for the Richmond Combined Sewer Overflow Project, do we know what percentage of that total overhaul that covers, 100 million?
I don't have that information in front of me, but I was discussing it with them following the subcommittee meeting this morning, and I will get that for you.
Thank you.
Madam Chair,
Senator McClellan.
I didn't see it, so I assume it's not there, but I just want to check. Does the governor's proposed amendments put anything in, either a placeholder or any other provision for funding that will be coming for broadband under the BEAD program under IIJA?
No, ma'am.
And do I understand correctly that that money cannot be distributed until it's appropriated by the General Assembly?
Yes.
Thank you.
I'm looking to my backup. Moving to transportation. The introduced budget proposes net increases totaling $150 million general fund and $254 million non-general fund over the biennium, and includes $150 million in general fund improvements for Interstate 64. And that brings the total to $470 million general fund dedicated for that purpose. And there's $5 million for studying the use of a public-private partnership for Interstate 81 improvements. The introduced budget recommends eliminating $30 million in the non-general fund appropriation for the Virginia Transportation Infrastructure Bank and redirecting the funding and $100 million in balances to the Transportation Partnership Opportunity Fund. And there's some additional language which deals with the allocation from that fund. And there's proposed capital outlay projects of $3.1 million for land acquisition adjacent to the Mid-Atlantic Regional Spaceport and $20 million for VDOT facility improvements.
Madam Chair?
Senator Evan.
On the Virginia Transportation Infrastructure Bank and redirecting that funding and the other balances to the Transportation Partnership Opportunity Fund, what's the difference between those two funds? I'm not really familiar with them.
The difference, and I'm going to ask Jason to speak to that question
Okay.
because transportation is a new area for me. Thank you.
Madam Chair, Senator Evan, the Infrastructure Bank traditionally makes loans to localities that are repaid, and the TPOF is a grant or loan program that can be used for broader categories of projects, including economic development access. It has been used extensively for some projects around the spaceport, and I believe that it could potentially be related to some MEI-approved projects that have yet to be announced.
Are there any further questions? All right, I'm going to turn it over to Jessica for general government. Thank you.
Here we go. Thank you all. If we move on to slide 49, just a quick overview for general government. The proposed amendments in the introduced budget include a net increase of $947.6 million over the biennium. I would note that of that, $55.3 million is derived from non-general funds, and of that, a significant portion is sourced out of the Internal Service Fund, which means that while it's categorized as non-general funds, it's actually coming out of the general funds allocated to other agencies who are then paying in for services. I'm going to skip over the highlights here just because we're going to cover them momentarily and go straight into the employee compensation proposals. So SB 800 includes a total of $305 million in proposed one-time bonuses, and we'll just go through each of those quickly. April mentioned the contingent bonus, the merit bonus of $100 million. The idea here is that it would be merit-based, dependent on an employee receiving a review of, I believe it's extraordinary contributor is the categorization used. And each employee who receives that categorization would then be eligible for a bonus of up to 10% of their total base salary. Moving on to flat rate bonuses, these would model the bonuses that were offered last year. So they would be distributed on December 1st. It would be a one-time bonus of $1,500, and the same employees from last year would be eligible here. Under the Department of Education, there's a merit bonus for instructional staff of up to $5,000. There's also a retention bonus of up to 1%. And then finally, there's an incentive, recruitment incentive of $5,000 for hard-to-staff positions in hard-to-staff schools. Are there any questions? Okay. Moving on to targeted compensation. This is a summary of compression adjustments and salary increases across agencies. Largely, you're going to see these in positions around law enforcement, non-attorney staff within the Office of the Attorney General, several food service and housekeeping positions within behavioral health-related agencies. Salary increases at the school for the Virginia School for the Deaf and Blind. Salary increases at the Department of Education last year didn't actually apply over to this school as it's a separate agency. And then you'll see adjustments for the Chief Medical Examiner and the Criminal Sentencing Commission. So I just want to go over some highlights under each secretarial area. And I will avoid talking about things that my colleagues have already discussed. So under the Office of the Lieutenant Governor, there's a proposed $500,000 for contract security. These contract security officers would operate independently of either Capitol Police staff or the Virginia State Police. There's also an additional $230,000 for 2 additional staff positions. This is a repeat of the request that was submitted last year. Moving on to the Office of the Attorney General, there's $2.5 million that's part of what Katie had mentioned under the Bold Blue Line initiative for a witness protection program. It would offer grants to both state and local law enforcement agencies. There's also another $885,000 tied to 8 positions that would support initiatives around cannabis and hemp regulation. I believe it would be 5 for cannabis consumer protection and then 3 around the proposed hemp regulation. Bless you. And then again, the salary compression issue within the office for non-attorney staff. Moving on to the Administration Secretariat, the Compensation Board, a key highlight here is a total of $4.1 million that Mike had mentioned to pilot the court-ordered transportation program. This is a new agency proposal. The Office of Data Governance and Analytics is currently housed within the Secretary of Administration. SB 800 proposes to separate that, create a new independent agency, and then double the staff size from 7 to 14. So that's what you're seeing here. Under the Department of General Services, I just wanted to draw your attention to a proposed $500,000 to contract a new Capitol Square master site plan. The proposal here includes language to consider impact on nearby residents and businesses, and also to consider opportunities for public-private partnerships. Finally, under VITA, there's a total of $18.7 million in new internal service fund charges to other state agencies based on system upgrades. But there's also a reduction of $31.9 million from the same internal service fund, simply to reflect adjusted projections in terms of the level of service that other agencies will request from VITA. Moving on to judicial. Under the Supreme Court, there's $3.5 million to support specialty treatment dockets, specifically serving veterans, behavioral health, and drug treatment programs. There's also language to revert $32.9 million of unexpended balances under the criminal fund for FY24. Then finally, there's a total of $1.7 million included to raise the per diem rate for retired recalled judges from $250 a day to $400 per day. Moving on to finance. Under the Department of Accounts, there's $644,000 in 5 positions to increase the quality assurance unit. April has already really covered everything under the Department of Accounts transfer payments. Again, a lot of these items, for instance, the $406 million toward the Revenue Stabilization Fund and the $250 million one-time payment to VRS were included in chapters, or were included earlier. But then also in Chapter 1, there's the language to advance $498.7 million from the Reservation Deposit Fund to the Revenue Reserve Fund. Under the Department of Treasury, there's approximately $500,000 to allow the agency to continue processing tax relief payments from 2022. And then finally, under the Treasury Board, there's $8.1 million in total savings realized from the bond defeasances. About $6 million of that comes from the Central Virginia Training Center, and then the remaining $2.1 million was related to the Eastern Shore Farmers Market. Under central appropriations, there's typically a lot there, and there is here this year as well. So I just wanted to run through again some of the highlights. There's $15 million to go toward initiatives under the Chief Transformation Officer. You'll recall that Chapter 2 included $10 million for fiscal 2023, so this would be another $15 million to bring the total to $25 million over the biennium. There's $5.9 million in FY24 to reimburse costs for the presidential primary. There's $5.2 million to upgrade statewide network infrastructure. My understanding is that it's about 20 years old statewide, and so this will be a much-needed system upgrade. There's $5 million in FY24 that Wendy had mentioned for VTOP. There's $1 million in FY24 to reimburse state-issued funds for violations tied to COVID-19. There's also $500,000 in FY24 related to plans for the relocation of the Washington Commanders. And then finally, there were reversions of $6.6 million in unexpended general fund balances, and then reversion of one-time savings realized for higher education institutions of $4.8 million in general funds and $2.9 million in non-general funds tied to lower than anticipated interest earnings and credit card rebates. Finally, just to quickly cover independent agencies, under the SCC, there's a working capital advance of $10 million to support implementation costs around the state health benefit exchange. And then finally, under Virginia Lottery, there will be $40.3 million in distributed revenues from casino tax collections to localities. The FY23 portion has already been distributed. So, are there any questions?
Questions? Apparently not.
All right, we'll wrap up with Tyler.
Okay, to capital outlays. So the governor's proposed amendments total $915 million for capital outlay. $605 million of that is general fund cash, with the remaining 90 revenue bonds or non-general fund cash. The governor's proposed budget includes no tax-supported debt for state capital outlay projects, but it does include tax-supported debt for two local and regional jail projects the state share, and that's because those projects had typically been funded with tax-supported debt, so they continued that practice. I'll just highlight on this table, you'll notice that top line in total, Chapter 2 in the Senate Bill 800 proposed amendments would result in about $2.7 billion in cash for general fund cash for capital outlay, which is a smart investment of one-time funds in a higher interest rate environment. And you'll notice that there's no tax-supported debt. Moving to the next slide, slide 60, this details the major general funds. Of that $604 million general funds, about 2/3 of that is for supplements for projects that are going over cost due to the environment that we're in. $100 million you had previously contingent on the fiscal year 22 balance sheet, and the governor appropriated that. And then there's an additional $300 million in new funds in fiscal year 2024. As I mentioned, the governor's budget is very slim for capital outlays, so there's very few planning projects or new construction. Projects that are included relate to life safety issues, water issues at facilities across the state. There's $43.3 million for a data facility at Jefferson Lab. There's $34 million for furnishing and equipment for capital projects nearing completion. There's $8 million each for maintenance reserve at Norfolk State and Virginia State. And then there's language authorizing short-term treasury loans for 2 veteran care centers to signal intent to the federal government of the state's commitment for a match if those projects were to be approved. Madam Chair, that completes capital outlay and the staff presentation, if there's questions for me or anyone else.
Are there questions for Tyler? Okay. April.
Madam Chair, if there are no further questions, I just wanted to make a quick announcement. All right, just a reminder, your budget amendments, your member amendments, and I know that includes the entire Senate, but for you as committee members, I wanted to go ahead and make the reminder. You will be receiving your draft versions of those amendments by noon to your district email address. I'm sure your aides will remember that because we also reminded them during the training, but there's a very quick turnaround time on that. By 5 p.m. if we could get the changes so that we can get those live and posted by no later than tomorrow. So just wanted to make that announcement. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Okay, there being no further business, we're adjourned and we'll see you tomorrow.